It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when suburban neighborhoods hum with quiet chores and the distant buzz of lawnmowers. The sun hung lazily overhead, casting soft golden light across the neatly trimmed lawns of Willow Creek Estates. The air smelled faintly of fresh grass and distant barbecues, and for most people, it was the perfect weekend. For me, it was the first day in months that I finally had the energy and time to tackle the mess in my garage. The garage door creaked and rattled as it slowly lifted. Dust particles floated in the shafts of sunlight streaming in, revealing a clutter of forgotten boxes, old tools, and stacked furniture that hadn't seen daylight in years. Among them sat my pride and joy, a vintage car I had been restoring for nearly a year. It was nothing particularly exotic, just a well-kept, late-model sedan with a fresh coat of silver paint and a set of wheels that gleamed like new. I had bought it off an auction for a steal, a project that turned into a weekend obsession. After months of elbow grease, it finally looked ready for the road. As the door settled into place, a quiet stillness lingered. That stillness didn't last long. Across the street, the sharp click of high heels echoed on concrete, cutting through the calm like a whip crack. There she was, Marjorie, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, the woman who had lived on this street longer than most, and who considered herself its keeper. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her sunglasses too large for her narrow face, and in her hands, she clutched her phone as if it were a badge of authority. Everyone in the neighborhood called her Karen, though never to her face. Her real name didn't matter much, because the title suited her better than any given one. She paused at the end of my driveway, her lips pursing as her eyes landed on the car. There was a twitch in her cheek, a slight narrowing of her eyes, and then a sharp inhale that could only mean one thing: trouble was brewing. From her stance alone, it was obvious she was scanning every detail of the vehicle, from the plates to the shine of the chrome. She muttered something under her breath, glanced down at her phone, and within seconds, her fingers were tapping furiously on the screen. I thought nothing of it at first. Marjorie had a reputation for complaining about everything: grass too long, trash cans out too early, kids playing too loudly. But this time, something in her posture was different. This wasn't her usual nosy interference. This was something more urgent, more accusatory. As I turned my attention back to the car, I noticed her lingering longer than usual. Her voice rose, sharp and shrill, though I couldn't make out the exact words over the hum of a distant leaf blower. A few moments later, the unmistakable sound of a phone call cut through the air. She wasn't just texting, she was calling. Minutes passed before I realized what was happening. Across the street, her voice climbed higher, more frantic, her arm gesturing wildly toward my garage. It wasn't until a faint echo of her words reached me: stolen, just bought, my car, that the absurdity of the situation began to sink in. She was calling 911. A pit formed in my stomach. I had heard the horror stories about people getting the cops called on them over misunderstandings, but this was beyond that. Marjorie was claiming that the car I had spent months restoring, the one I had the papers for, the one that sat in my garage all along, was hers. The neighborhood, usually a tableau of quiet weekend chores, began to stir. Curtains shifted, a door or two cracked open. The silent suburban audience had been summoned by the shrill energy of a looming scene. Neighbors peeked out from behind hedges, clutching their coffee mugs, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The minutes stretched on like hours until the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. A patrol car rolled up the street, its lights flickering quietly, more a formality than a rush. But the sight of it sent a ripple through the watching crowd. Marjorie stood tall, her face flushed with righteous indignation, as though the cavalry had arrived to validate her crusade. I stood frozen beside the open garage, hands still dusty from the boxes I had been moving, watching the slow unraveling of a neighborhood afternoon into something I couldn't yet name. The officer stepped out, his hand resting casually on his belt, his gaze shifting from her waving hands to the car behind me. She was already pointing, gesturing, recounting a story too fantastical to make sense, her voice sharp with the thrill of perceived justice. What struck me then wasn't fear or anger, but disbelief. Disbelief that opening my garage door, a mundane, everyday act, had summoned this. Disbelief that a neighbor's baseless accusation could so quickly escalate into a formal police presence. Disbelief that the simple life I had chosen in this quiet cul-de-sac was about to become anything but simple. As the officer approached, the neighborhood leaned in, waiting for a verdict that had yet to be written. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a car, or a misunderstanding, or even Marjorie's endless hunger for control. This was the start of something bigger, something that would ripple far beyond one Saturday afternoon. Because when a person like Marjorie sets her sights on you, it's rarely just one battle. It's a campaign. The officer stepped closer, his expression unreadable, as the hum of whispers rose behind him. The street felt smaller now, tighter, as though the very air had thickened with anticipation. And as I glanced at the gleaming car in my garage, I knew this was no longer just about restoration. This was about to become a test, of patience, of boundaries, and of how far a self-proclaimed enforcer of rules was willing to go. The sun dipped slightly, throwing longer shadows across the driveway. Somewhere down the street, a door clicked shut. Somewhere else, a phone camera discreetly started recording. And Marjorie, sensing her audience, straightened her shoulders, ready to take this further. The patrol car's presence transformed the once quiet cul-de-sac into a stage. Neighbors who had been casually observing from their windows now edged closer to their lawns, arms crossed, their expressions a mix of concern and intrigue. The officer, a tall man with a neutral expression, walked slowly toward the garage, scanning the car, the driveway, and finally me. Behind him, Marjorie was in full performance mode, waving her arms, tapping on her phone screen, and pointing repeatedly at the car like it was a smoking gun. The questions came first in the officer's cautious tone: ownership, proof, recent activity, and though no accusations were officially made, the weight of Marjorie's words lingered in the air. She insisted she had just purchased a car matching this exact description, insisted that it had been stolen right from under her nose, and insisted that I, her neighbor, had somehow taken it. The story had holes wide enough to drive a truck through, but the sheer confidence with which she delivered it gave it momentum. I retrieved my paperwork, the faded bill of sale, the insurance documents, the title, everything neatly stacked in a folder I had kept in the house. The officer flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing slightly as he verified the details. Each page tilted the scale back toward reason, but Marjorie would not relent. She leaned over his shoulder, her manicured finger jabbing at dates and signatures, trying to find some discrepancy that would vindicate her crusade. The neighbors whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads, clearly recognizing the absurdity. Others stayed quiet, unwilling to pick a side so early. In a neighborhood like Willow Creek, appearances mattered more than truth at first glance, and siding against the HOA president, even informally, was a risk many weren't ready to take. Eventually, the officer closed the folder, handed it back, and murmured something that sounded like a dismissal of her claim. But that didn't stop Marjorie. If anything, it fueled her. The police had done their part, and now, in her mind, it was time for the HOA to do theirs. By Monday morning, an email had circulated through the neighborhood mailing list. It was long, formal, and dripping with condescension. Marjorie had written it, of course, under the letterhead of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. It stated, in carefully chosen language, that there had been an incident involving a suspicious vehicle, that the board was investigating possible violations, and that residents were encouraged to report any irregular automotive activities. Though my name wasn't directly mentioned, the subtext was clear. The car in my garage had become the subject of a neighborhood watch disguised as a memo. The following week was a parade of passive-aggressive encounters. Neighbors slowed their walks as they passed my house, eyes darting to the garage door as though they expected the vehicle to roll away in the night. A few left anonymous notes on my mailbox, thinly veiled reminders about community guidelines, driveway usage, and proper registration. Even the neighborhood kids, once cheerful and curious, gave my driveway a wide berth. The car itself became a symbol, though I never intended it to be. To me, it was just a project, a hobby that had given me something to look forward to during long, quiet months. But to Marjorie, it was leverage, a tool to reinforce her authority, and to the HOA board, it was now a problem they were expected to address. The absurdity of it all was matched only by its persistence. 2 weeks later, a formal notice arrived. It was sealed in an envelope with the HOA crest, folded neatly and slipped under my door. The language was even colder than the email. There had been a complaint, it said, about the storage of an unauthorized or potentially unregistered vehicle. I was instructed to provide proof of ownership and a statement of intent regarding its presence within 7 days. Failure to comply could result in fines, escalation, or even a hearing. It was a trap, of course. I had already shown my proof to the police. The matter, in any reasonable sense, should have been closed. But this wasn't about reason. It was about persistence, about grinding someone down until they either complied or moved. It was the HOA's oldest trick, and with Marjorie at the helm, it was now in full swing. I spent that week gathering every scrap of evidence I could. Bills, photographs, emails from the auction where I'd bought the car, even before and after pictures of the restoration. If they wanted a statement, I would give them one that left no room for their manufactured doubts. Still, something felt different now. This wasn't just a hobby anymore, it was a target painted in metallic silver, parked behind a garage door that suddenly felt too thin to protect it. I started parking my other car on the street instead, keeping the garage closed unless absolutely necessary. I noticed Marjorie's car idling nearby more often than usual. Sometimes she would pause just long enough to take a photo. Other times, she lingered across the street, her phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes locked on my driveway. By the time the HOA board scheduled their informal review, the lines were drawn. Marjorie had her loyalists, those who believed her claims without question, convinced that any resistance was an affront to community order. I had documents, facts, a file thicker than the flimsy accusations she had cobbled together. But facts, I was beginning to realize, didn't always win in neighborhoods like this. The day of the review was overcast, heavy with that strange suburban tension that lives somewhere between politeness and hostility. I handed over my folder, listened as Marjorie presented her version, grandiose, full of speculation and second-hand assertions, and watched as the board members nodded along with polite expressions that revealed nothing. It was all very civil, very procedural, and utterly exhausting. When it was over, they promised to deliberate. Marjorie left with a satisfied smirk that said the process itself was her victory. The board, after all, rarely ruled quickly, and the longer this dragged on, the more power she wielded. Every day without resolution was another day, the neighborhood whispered, another day I was quietly cast as the suspicious figure in an otherwise tidy street. That night, I sat in the dim glow of the garage, staring at the car as if it might offer an answer. Its silver body reflected the light in soft ripples, the result of countless hours of sanding, priming, and polishing. It didn't look like trouble. It looked like something I had earned. But trouble, I was starting to see, wasn't always about what was real. Sometimes, it was about who had the louder voice, the bigger platform, the willingness to escalate until everyone else grew too tired to fight. The days following the so-called informal review felt heavier, as though the neighborhood itself had shifted its posture. The board had not yet delivered its decision, but their silence worked in Marjorie's favor. Without a formal resolution, her version of events lingered like a stain no one could wash out. The car, though innocent and meticulously documented as mine, became a phantom antagonist in whispered conversations, an uninvited guest in a community obsessed with control. Marjorie, emboldened by the lack of pushback, escalated in ways that were more insidious than dramatic. Her tactics shifted from open confrontation to quiet sabotage. One morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door, claiming that my garage posed a visual disturbance and needed to remain closed except for approved maintenance. Another day, a letter arrived suggesting that non-compliance with HOA directives could lead to property re-evaluation, a thinly veiled threat aimed at my home's standing in the community. Neighbors began behaving differently. The friendly wave from across the street became a half-hearted nod. Conversations at the mailbox grew shorter, clipped, their words weighed before being spoken. Some looked at me with pity, others with mild suspicion, as if merely living near Marjorie's chosen target might somehow invite scrutiny. I had become the cautionary tale of Willow Creek, the resident who brought trouble upon himself by daring to own something she coveted. The car itself became a silent witness to this unfolding drama. I kept it parked in the garage most days now, its polished surface covered with a dust sheet, its tires resting on foam pads to avoid flat spots. Every time I uncovered it to check the fluids or start the engine, I felt eyes on me, sometimes from Marjorie's upstairs window, other times from the slow-moving SUVs that crawled past my driveway. The car hadn't moved illegally, hadn't been involved in anything beyond my own hobby, but it was enough. In this suburb, perception outweighed truth. Then came the incident with the locksmith. It was a Friday evening when I returned home to find a stranger fiddling near my garage door, a clipboard in his hand and a confused look on his face. He claimed he had been called to re-secure the property. When pressed, he revealed that the work order came from the HOA office, authorized by a board member, to prevent unauthorized access. They had In essence, tried to lock me out of my own garage based on an unproven complaint. I sent him away before any damage was done, but the message was clear: this was no longer about rules. This was about forcing my hand. Over the weekend, I'd documented everything: the locksmith's card, the notices, the letters, even the timestamps on the photos Marjorie had been taking from her car. I sent copies to the HOA board via certified mail, not because I believed it would change their behavior, but because I wanted a record. If this turned legal, and it was beginning to look like it might, I would need a trail they couldn't erase. Marjorie's behavior only intensified. She began parking her SUV deliberately close to my driveway, creating a visual blockade that drew the eyes of every passing resident. She hosted informal gatherings with select neighbors, thinly disguised as community coffee mornings, where she repeated her version of events like a mantra: that I had stolen a car, that the police were incompetent, that the HOA was the only line of defense left. Each move was calculated to isolate me, to make me feel like an outsider in a street I had lived on for years. And for a time, it worked. I caught myself avoiding the front porch, skipping neighborhood walks, letting the mail pile up just to avoid the stairs. The car, once a source of pride, now felt like a weight tethering me to an unending feud. But in that quiet, something began to shift, not in the neighborhood, but in me. I realized that compliance had only fed the machine. I had played by their rules, provided the documents, attended the meetings, answered every baseless accusation with calm logic, and still, they pressed on. There was no satisfying people like Marjorie, because the point wasn't to resolve the conflict, the point was to sustain it. So I changed my approach. I stopped hiding the car. On a bright Tuesday morning, I rolled it out into the driveway, polished and shining, and let it sit in the sun. I knew she would see it. I knew she would react. And she did. By that afternoon, she had called a special HOA meeting, scheduled for the following week, this time with the agenda explicitly stating unauthorized vehicle seizure and community security response. It was a bold, reckless escalation, one that suggested she either believed her own narrative or no longer cared about how absurd it sounded. Word spread quickly. Flyers appeared on doorsteps. An online thread buzzed with speculation. Some residents, emboldened by her noise, began posting passive-aggressive comments on the neighborhood forum. Others reached out to me quietly, offering sympathetic messages or forwarding screenshots of her rants. The neighborhood was dividing, not because of the car, but because of the spectacle she had created around it. The night before the meeting, I received another envelope under my door. This one was thinner, almost hurriedly prepared. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A preliminary fine notice for storage of disputed property. The amount was absurd, the language aggressive, and the signature at the bottom unmistakably hers. It was the moment the conflict tipped from nuisance to open hostility. I no longer doubted her intent. She wanted the car, or, at the very least, she wanted me gone. And she was willing to use every lever the HOA offered to get her way. The morning of the meeting dawned gray, with a sharp wind that rattled the leaves against the sidewalks. Residents gathered in the community center, clutching coffee cups and muttering about keeping the neighborhood safe. I walked in with my folder, heavier now with weeks of evidence, and the quiet buzz of the room shifted just slightly. Marjorie was already at the front, her notes spread across a table, her posture triumphant. This was the moment she had built toward, and this time, I wasn't going to let her own the stage uncontested. The community center smelled faintly of burnt coffee and disinfectant wipes, its fluorescent lights casting a cold, indifferent glow over the gathering crowd. Chairs were arranged in a loose semicircle, the kind of setup that suggested openness but really funneled every pair of eyes toward the table at the front, where the board members sat like judges presiding over a suburban tribunal. Marjorie stood at their side, her arms crossed, her lips curved into a thin smile that barely concealed her anticipation. By the time the clock struck 7, the room was nearly full. Retirees with folded arms, parents with restless kids tugging at their sleeves, the usual assortment of self-proclaimed community watchdogs, everyone was there, lured by the promise of drama disguised as community security concerns. The air buzzed with low whispers, the occasional cough punctuating the tension. I could feel the weight of their stares as I took my seat in the back row, my folder of evidence resting heavily in my lap. The meeting began with procedural formalities: attendance, budget mentions, landscaping updates, an obligatory appetizer before the real meal. Then, at last, the topic was introduced. Item 4, unauthorized vehicle seizure and HOA enforcement options. The words landed with a hush, followed by the rustle of papers and the creak of chairs as bodies leaned forward. Marjorie seized the moment with the ease of someone who had rehearsed every syllable. Her version of events flowed like a well-oiled machine. She painted a picture of a neighborhood under threat, a car that had mysteriously appeared, a transaction gone wrong, a resident who had refused to cooperate. Each exaggeration drew a few sympathetic nods from the usual loyalists. She flashed a printout of the vehicle's photo, conveniently stripped of context, and spoke with the certainty of someone who believed that volume equaled truth. But this time, I was ready. When my turn came, I didn't match her theatrics. I laid out the facts in cold, deliberate order: dates, receipts, correspondence with the auction house, even the original police incident report that had dismissed her claim weeks ago. I handed copies to the board, to the residents sitting closest, to anyone willing to look at more than her narrative. I showed photographs of the car in its unrestored state, dusty and dented, long before Marjorie claimed to have purchased anything like it. I even included a statement from the officer who had visited that day, confirming there had been no evidence of theft. The room shifted. Murmurs replaced nods. People glanced from my folder to her table, the cracks in her story finally visible beneath the harsh light of documented truth. Marjorie tried to interrupt, waving her arms and insisting on further investigation, but the momentum was gone. Her performance, so potent in whispers and email threads, faltered when held against tangible proof. The board recessed briefly, a quiet huddle behind their table, their expressions tight and unreadable. When they returned, the decision was delivered without ceremony. The complaint was dismissed. The car was legally mine. No further action would be taken by the HOA. The fine notice, the threats, the notices, they were all declared void. A ripple of reaction swept through the room. Some residents clapped softly, others exchanged knowing looks, and a few slipped out quietly, unwilling to linger now that the spectacle had soured. Marjorie, however, did not leave. She stood stiffly, her face pale beneath her foundation, her hands clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. For the first time, she had not gotten her way. For the first time, her voice had failed to drown out the truth. In the days that followed, the neighborhood recalibrated. The tension didn't vanish overnight, but it loosened, like a knot that had finally been tugged free. The anonymous notes stopped arriving. The SUVs that once crawled past my driveway now drove by at normal speed. A few neighbors even apologized, not outright, but in the form of casual greetings, a shared nod at the mailbox, an extra wave on a morning walk. The car returned to its place in the garage, this time without fear of being turned into ammunition. Marjorie, though, did not retreat gracefully. She tried one last desperate tactic, a letter accusing the board of negligence, claiming I had influenced the process, demanding a second review. But without the weight of evidence, her words fell flat. The board issued a polite but firm statement, reminding her that false accusations could result in penalties under their own bylaws. It was the first time I had seen them stand up to her, and it marked the quiet end of her campaign. Life returned.